The Lord be with you. So I've chosen a different reading today in honor of the Superbowl, because it's going to point up to what I'm going to talk about this morning. It's a reading from the Bhagavad-Gita, this great Sanskrit Hindu wisdom. And it's actually from the introduction of a particular translation that I like a lot. And it's an explanation of what this book is about, what the first scene is about. And as I was reading it, as I was meeting the two warring armies, the Pandavas and the Kausuras, I was thinking, should I translate panthers and broncos? Or instead of Arjuna, should I stick in like Peyton Manning? Or, I resisted the temptation, so I'm going to give it to you in the original. So the story behind it is two warring families. They're interrelated, but they're having to go to war because of a dispute over ownership. And Arjuna is the prince of the Pandavas, and Krishna is actually, he's the second person of the Hindu Trinity, just like Jesus is an incarnation of the second person of the Christian Trinity. And so Krishna is an incarnation of Vishnu, the god Vishnu. And so this is the story in the great, great book called the Mahabharata. And this is from the introduction to a particular translation of it. The great Mahabharata war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas took place on the holy plain of Kurukshetra after the failure of Lord Krishna's peace mission, when he himself went to Hastinapura as the emissary of the Pandavas. There was no other alternative for the Pandavas but to engage in war for their rightful share of the kingdom. All the famous warriors from both sides had assembled on the battlefield. Tents and wagons, weapons and machines, chariots and animals covered the vast plain. Lord Krishna arrived on the scene in a magnificent chariot yoked by white horses. He was to act as the charioteer of Arjuna, one of the Pandava princes. The din of hundreds of conches blaring forth suddenly announced the commencement of the battle. Arjuna blew his conch, while Bhima, his brother, sounded his. All the other great warriors blew on their conches. As the two armies were arrayed ready for battle, Arjuna requested Krishna to place his chariot between the two armies so that he might survey his opponents. He was bewildered by the scene before him, for he beheld on both sides fathers and grandfathers, teachers and uncles, fathers-in-law, grandsons, relatives, and comrades. Confusion reigned in Arjuna's mind. Should he participate in this terrible carnage? Was it proper to destroy one's relatives for the sake of a kingdom and some pleasures? Would it not be much better for him to surrender everything in favor of his enemies and retire in peace? As these thoughts rushed into his mind, a feeling of despondency overtook Arjuna. He had no enthusiasm to engage in the battle. Letting his bow slip from his hands, Arjuna could do nothing but turn to Lord Krishna for guidance and enlightenment. A word inspired by God. Today, around 120 million people will watch another famous battle. It's Americans' version of the war in Kurukshetra. It's our 21st century version of the Roman Colosseum, in which they're going to go at it. And by maybe 8 o'clock tonight, we'll find out, who are the Christians and who are the lions. 114.4 million people watched last year's Super Bowl. And they're expecting maybe about 120 million to watch this particular one. And the spectators will be gathered around a different kind of fireplace from old. It'll be a fireplace that we call a TV set. And they'll be gathered around this, and they will create literally billions of stories. Every play will be dissected. And tomorrow morning's newspapers, and go off into the future, people will talk about whether they were playing in it themselves, or there were spectators down in Santa Clara, or they were just watching it on their TV sets. It will generate literally billions of stories. And so that's what I'm going to weave together today. I'm going to just make 3 main points this morning. I'll talk about the story of fire, and then secondly, the fire of story, and then thirdly, the intersection between story and fire. That's the 3 points I'll make this morning. So the story of fire. Fire was discovered about 800,000 years ago. Long, long, long before Homo sapiens sapiens. Homo sapiens sapiens is only around for about 50,000 years. Long, long, long before even, Homo sapiens sapiens is around for 50,000 years. It was even long before Homo sapiens that arrived on the scene 200,000 years ago. So some earlier hominid had discovered fire. And we know that for definite now because of archaeological digs in a cave in Israel, where they found in the back of a cave a fireplace with animal bones inside it. So some group of hominids 800,000 years ago, had used fire to cook their food and to warm themselves. So fire, the invention of fire, the discovery, I'm not so sure they invented it, but they discovered it, maybe watching lightning strike someplace and begin to see the fires that emerged. And so it goes back about 800,000 years to some earlier group of hominids, long before Homo sapiens sapiens or even Homo sapiens. So it goes back a long way. And what did these beings use it for? It seems to me they employed it for 4 different kinds of uses. I think maybe accidentally they discovered maybe watching a fire that had devastated an area, and they're out hunting, scavenging for food, and they come across a burned carcass of an antelope, and because there's not live antelope available, they were used to eating just raw meat, they decided to eat this. And one might say to the other, wow, this tastes good. Yeah, I like it. How's yours? Well done. How's yours? Medium rare. So they began to think, yeah, maybe there's a value to this. So we began to use fire to cook our food for ourselves. We began to use it as a form of protection. We then discovered that somehow we could carry fire around with us, and that in the presence of fire, animals stayed away. So the wild animals stayed away from the fireplaces, and so now we got protection as well. A third use, I think, would have been the warmth that it gave off on cold, Arctic kinds of climates. The heat that came out from the fire was great. And the fourth thing was it gave light. We could actually see each other, and we could learn to use torches and carry the light into dark places. So we used it for at least these 4 purposes, way back in ancient times. But in actual fact, fire had been invented long, 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 long before 800,000 years ago. It goes back at least 4.6 billion years. In actual fact, it goes back about 13.7 billion years, because all fire comes from the sun. So when you look at this extraordinary effect that this fire has, on life, the first creatures that learned how to harvest the energy of the sun was the plant life. And so through a series of photosynthetic changes and chlorophyll, it could translate sunlight into energy for itself. So the first thieves on the planet were plants. They learned how to steal, energy from sunlight. And initially, they were keeping it to themselves. And then at some stage, animals arrived, and animals weren't very, very good, at photosynthesis. They couldn't turn the sunlight into energy, so they discovered a trick. They just stole from the plants. It was like one thief stealing from another thief who stole it from somebody who actually owned the property. So the second group came along, and they were called the herbivores, the ungulates, cows and deer and stuff like that. And they learned that by eating the grasses and the plants, they could steal the energy that the plants had translated from sunlight and created for metabolism inside their own body. So they're real happy campers, going around just chewing the cud. And then at a later stage, the carnivores arrived. And the carnivores are less talented than the ungulates and the plant life. They don't know how to do photosynthesis, and they don't know how to turn grass and stuff into energy, so they eat the guys who eat the grass. So the carnivores are now eating, the herbivores. And then at some stage, a very talented group arrives, and they're called the omnivores. And we're part of the omnivores. The omnivores can actually eat vegetables and get energy from it. I don't do that much. I'm not good on that. And then there's the carnivore side of it. They can turn meat into it as well. So now you've got this extraordinary ability that they've translated this sunlight, this fire from the sun, into energy for an omnivore who can turn all situations to their own advantage. So that's how one track of it looked. The second track looked like this. At some stage, foliage fell to the ground and wasn't eaten by any ungulate or any creature of any kind, and it became compressed and pressed down over millions and millions and millions of years. And so now you had a fossilized form of energy. And typically we find it in 3 forms. You find it in coal, petrified coal, or you find it in natural gases, or you find it in oils of various kinds, gasoline or stuff like that. And we learn at some stage, maybe with the combustion engine or something, that if you introduce live fire to this medium, this fossilized fire, you can create this extraordinary energy. All the ways from starting your engine in your car to nuclear fusion and nuclear fission. It's literally applying a little bit of fire to a fossilized energy that came from fire itself. And that's a fairly recent discovery, that we could take fossilized energy and somehow reignite it. It's like the story of, Sleeping Beauty, that it needed the prince to come along to kiss her and wake her back up. So it needed kind of a little bit of real fire, naked flame, to set fire to the energy in the fossilized stuff that had been there for millions and millions of years. And then very recently, we've learned how to do a little bit of photosynthesis ourselves. We've invented PVC panels so that can drink energy from the sun, take direct current, store it in our batteries, and then deliver it to the house as alternating current to light up our homes. So the story of fire is a fascinating journey. And it's helped us, cook our food. We're still using it. Even modern electricity is basically doing the same 4 things for you. It's cooking your food. It's also protection. It's your alarm signal. Even fire itself can be used to tell you that fire is happening. If you've got a fire detector in your house or a smoke detector in your house, it's fire from the sun via electricity that's alerting to you the fact that fire could burn down your house. So we're using fire to fight fire. So we're still using it as a protection. We're still using it as a light source, and we're still using it to warm ourselves. So in some senses, we're not doing anything different from the hominids 800,000 years ago. A little bit more sophisticated, but basically the same thing. So that's a very, very brief history of fire. Second point I want to make then is, that's the story of fire. Now I want to talk about the fire of story. Once Homo sapiens sapiens arrived on the scene, which was about 50,000 years ago, and we developed language skills. That was the beginning of language. I believe that the very first use to which we put language was storytelling. And it's interesting, it always happened around a fire. So there was something about fire that took the fire, that induced us to share stories with each other. And we sat around the fire and we traded stories. And the stories, in some senses again, had the same function, as fire itself had. And you find that in all traditions, you go to Ireland, you go to America, you go to Africa, you go to Australia, any place you go, any place you meet human people, any place you find Homo sapiens sapiens, you find their stories, their archived stories. And the stories, it seems to me, do the very same things that fire does for us. The first thing, fire gives us light. Stories give us light. The light of making observations. As we're walking about the savannah in East Africa, we're making observations. And so, the stories allow us to archive those observations. And then we cook it. We use it to cook. Fire is used to cook. Stories are used to cook. In other words, they extract the essence of, or the significance of what the observations have been. So we're using fire now, we're using stories in the same way we use fire, to extract the essence, to cook the observations into some kind of a meaningful understanding of the situation. And we use it, to warm ourselves, just like we use fire to warm ourselves. We use stories to warm ourselves, in the sense that stories are the thing that bind us together in little tribal groups. So we warm each other by coming together as a unit, and this is what stories do for us. So they warm us by creating a sense of community or a sense of togetherness. And then they protect us. They protect us in the sense that initially, stories are kind of efforts to deal with existential angst. If you're, somebody on the plains of East Africa 50,000 years ago in a very, very difficult world, trying to make sense of the fact that everybody around you, dies very, very, very young, and there are storms of various kinds, and wild animals attack you, and you're wondering why you're here, who created this, what's this about? So the first level of storytelling is to try to make sense of those observations, to unpack those some way, and make some kind of cosmologies or some kind of meaning out of these things. It leads then to the second stage, I believe, is to some kind of xenophobia. Almost inevitably, we tell stories to ourselves that make us different from everybody who is not us. So our little group is always special, and the other guys are the dangerous guys. So the second stage of storytelling is to create the protection of xenophobia, and it's alive and kicking in our modern world still. We continue to tell stories that make us feel special and point out who the bad guys are on the other side. That's the second stage of the protection afforded by storytelling. But there's a third stage, and it is enlightenment when we finally begin to tell stories that really align with the core meaning of the observations. That's the realization that we're all equally children of God. So we have to learn how to step ourselves through the stories. So we start off and we don't have any stories. Homo sapiens sapiens at the beginning, they had no stories. They could not explain, their experiences of life. And then they began to create stories. And the stories initially are helpful, but they're very crippling. They're very confining. And so the journey of storytelling is to tell better and better versions of the data. And finally, we can tell versions of the story that are liberating, that allow us to identify the God in everybody rather than create xenophobia against the bad guys and the good guys. And then finally, we reach a place where there is no need for stories anymore. Now, the stories are the things that liberate us or cripple us. And so the very famous, Hindu mystic Krishnamurti said one time, all human suffering lies in the gap between the ego and the self. In other words, between the experience and the interpretation of the experience, between the observation and the story I make up about what I've observed. All human suffering lies in that gap. And the idea is, by telling better and better stories, we begin to liberate ourselves from that trap, until finally we don't need stories anymore. The mystics don't need stories. There's so much in the presence of the mystery of God that they're not going to foist any artificial interpretation on their experiences. And that's the journey that, fire and story offer to us. The journey back into that realization that story is the way in which we walk ourselves through the evolutionary trajectory, having come from God and walking our way back into God. So that's the great fire, that's the great charism, that's the great energy of storytelling. And the last point I want to make then is, what happens when these two things intersect? When you get fire and storytelling intersecting with each other. And again, you find that everything comes alive when you do this. When you intersect these two pieces, everything comes alive. And so where I live, many of you have been up in my house, I'm totally off the grid. So I've got my own septic system, my own well for water, and my own power source, which is solar panels. I got an 8 kilowatt solar panel array. But occasionally, during a period of the year when there's very, very little sunlight, such as happened 4 or 5 weeks ago for 10 or 11 days at a time, I had to kind of use a backup generator. So I also have a 25 kilowatt diesel generator, which I use on occasions like that. And they're all plugged in, they're coordinated together. Now, the interesting thing is, that is the kind of the intersection between the two pieces. Because the solar panels I have, it's just an 8 kilowatt system, but it is taking energy directly from the sun, putting into batteries, then going through an inverter and bringing it down to my house as alternating current. But in the times when there's not enough sun, I fire up the generator, and the generator is worked on fossil fuels, on diesel. So it's an ancient, archived kind of fire. So here's a combination of two kinds of energy. Current fire, no pun intended, coming directly from sunlight, and then archived energy coming from fossil. Now, the great teachers of history, have been such people. You look at Jesus, for instance, and Jesus, in my opinion, is the person who was able to straddle the fossil fuels, and the solar panels. The fossil fuels being the Old Testament, and I'm not using that disrespectfully. I'm using fossil in the sense of archived energy, not in kind of outdated. And so in some senses, Jesus is the intersection point between the archived energy of Judaism and the Old Testament and the solar panels of the New Testament. That was his function, to be able to utilize both of those. And that is our function in some senses as well, to be able to cross-fertilize these pieces. And so it's interesting to me, Carl Jung used a phrase, Gnostic intermediary, to talk about somebody who's absolutely conversant or au fait with two different languages and is able to cross-fertilize them effortlessly. Is that this is the kind of person who can bring cultures together so that they can learn from each other. And if I were to pick out one kind of technical symbol that represents that for me, in my own system up at home, it would be the inverter. Now, the inverter is a little machine, and here's what it does. When the sun hits a solar array, it creates direct current that's stored in a battery. But the direct current won't reach my house, it won't work in the house. It has to be adapted in some fashion. So there's an inverter that changes the direct current into alternating current, and then it feeds my house. But the inverter also does a different thing. When I put on my diesel generator, it's producing alternating current. It comes back through the inverter, and the inverter converts it into direct current and stores it in my battery. So it's working in both directions. It's a bilingual device that's able to take energy from a generator, fossilized energy, and turn it into DC, or take DC energy and turn it into AC. Now, with those kind of technical terms, I would just want to propose this, that there's a place where stories and fire intersect. And there are many different versions of fire in our times. So whether we like it or not, the modern equivalent of a fireplace around which people gathered and told stories is your television set, or your iPad, or your computer device. And people will be sitting around that today, literally in their millions, watching stories unfold. And so the idea is to become an inverter for our times, to be the kind of person who can move seamlessly between the fossil fuels of archived wisdom and the modern fuels of the solar panels, and to sit around whatever kind of fire you find yourself in today, whether it's a coal fire out in the bush someplace as you're hiking, or whether it's a television set with your neighbours with a pizza and a bottle of beer.